A woman was 3 minutes from freezing to death when a rancher who trusted no one opened his door and said 2 words that would cost him everything he thought he wanted. Wyoming Territory, winter of 1888. Snow came sideways across the range that night, driven by a wind that had already buried the fence line twice. A widow stumbled through it with a newborn wrapped against her chest and a boy at her side who could barely lift his knees anymore. Behind them, far back where the storm hadn't swallowed the horizon yet, 3 riders moved in a straight, patient line, the kind of line men ride when they already know where the chase will end. Caleb Hart stood on his porch with a rifle in his hands and watched all of it happen at once. He had spent 6 years making sure nothing in his life needed defending. No wife. No children. No reason for a man to come calling with trouble in his saddlebag. He told himself the ranch was enough, and most days he believed it. Then a woman with blue lips looked straight at his lit window and changed direction, and every rule he'd built his life around stopped mattering. She reached the bottom step and went down onto one knee, the baby still clutched tight, the boy grabbing for her sleeve. "Please," she said. "Just until the storm breaks." Caleb looked at the baby's face, gray at the edges. He looked at the boy's boots, soaked through. Then he looked past them, at the riders now stopped at the far fence, watching. "Bring the children inside," he said. The woman's eyes went wide. "You don't know what you're doing. If they see me walk through that door, they'll come for you next." Caleb held the door open wider. "Let them talk. If this story already has you leaning forward, go ahead and subscribe to see how it unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and follow along with you as this story finds its way to its ending. Because the men circling that ranch weren't hunting a widow over a debt. They were hunting her because of what her dead husband had found, and what he'd hidden before it got him killed. 3 days before the widow appeared at his fence line, Caleb Hart's life ran the way it had run for 6 winters straight, early to rise, hard work until dark, and no one to answer to but the cattle and the weather. His ranch sat 4 miles outside Red Creek, close enough to trade at the general store, far enough that nobody dropped by without a reason. He liked it that way. Jacob Boone, who'd worked the place with him since before the bad years, liked to say Caleb had picked the most isolated piece of land in the county on purpose, just so folks would have to work for the privilege of bothering him. "You'll die out here alone," Jacob told him once, over coffee gone cold in the bunkhouse. "Man's got to die somewhere," Caleb said, and that had been the end of it. Red Creek knew the shape of Caleb's story even if nobody said it to his face. 9 years back he'd had a wife, Martha, and for 2 short years a daughter besides. A fever came through the valley the winter little Ellen turned 2, and it took her in 4 days. Martha followed 6 months later, not from illness but from something quieter that never had a name, grief that simply refused to let her keep living. Caleb buried them both under the same cottonwood tree behind the house and decided, standing over that ground, that loving people was a door he wasn't going to open again. Not because he'd stopped being capable of it. Because he knew exactly what it cost when it was taken back. So he built walls instead of a family. He ran 300 head of cattle with Jacob's help and 2 seasonal hands, kept his ledger straight, paid his debts on time, and let the town gossip about him however it wanted. Distant, they called him. Some said cold. Nobody who actually knew him used either word, because almost nobody did. That 3rd morning before the storm, Caleb stood at his kitchen window with coffee in hand, watching gray clouds pile up over the mountains like something was building behind them. Jacob came in stomping snow off his boots. "Weather's turning ugly," Jacob said. "Ugliest I've seen since the winter we lost the north herd." "We'll bring the stock in close tonight," Caleb said. He had no idea, standing there, that the storm rolling toward his ranch would carry more than snow. He had no idea that somewhere on the road from the Whitmore place, a widow named Clara was already running, her boy Eli half carrying his baby sister while 3 men on horseback searched every ranch light between her and the county line. By the time the first flakes started falling that evening, Caleb had already checked the horses twice and banked the fire high. He sat by the window with a book he wasn't really reading, the wind picking up outside, and told himself the winter would pass the way every winter passed, quiet and alone, and exactly the way he'd chosen it. By the time the wind picked up past dusk, Caleb had walked the porch twice just to feel the temperature drop by the hour. Jacob joined him on the second pass, collar up, breath fogging. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Jacob asked, out of nowhere. "Selling up, moving somewhere with more neighbors and fewer blizzards." "Every winter," Caleb said. "Then spring comes and I forget why I wanted to." Jacob chuckled low. "Man alive, you're a stubborn one." "Learned it from somebody," Caleb said, and Jacob laughed outright at that, because he'd been the one who taught Caleb most of what he knew about ranching, stubbornness included. They went in before the worst of it hit, banked the stove, and settled into the kind of silence two men share when neither one needs to fill it. Caleb didn't sleep well that night. He told himself it was the wind rattling the shutters. He didn't yet know how wrong he was, about the wind, and about a great many other things besides. Once the door shut behind them, the cabin felt smaller and louder than it had in years. Clara Whitmore sat on the edge of Caleb's hearth rug with Rose still bundled against her, shivering so hard her teeth clicked. Eli stood a few feet off, arms crossed tight over his soaked coat, watching Caleb the way a boy watches a dog he isn't sure is friendly. "Get her out of that wet blanket," Caleb said, already crossing to the trunk at the foot of his bed. He came back with two quilts that hadn't been touched since Ellen was small and didn't let himself think about that as he handed them over. "Wrap the baby in this one. Dry one for you." Clara's hands shook too badly to manage the knot at Rose's chin. Caleb crouched down, careful, and undid it himself, keeping his eyes on the baby and not the mother's face, which was doing everything it could not to fall apart. "She's cold clear through," Clara said. "I couldn't get her warm enough on the trail. She'll warm faster now. Get close to the fire." Caleb glanced at Eli. "You. Sit." Eli didn't move. "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." Caleb went to put the kettle on, and if he noticed the boy edging half a step closer to the flames a minute later, he didn't say so. Jacob came in from checking the barn, stopped dead in the doorway, and took in the scene. A stranger woman wrapped in his boss's dead wife's quilt, a hollow-eyed boy, an infant, and Caleb crouched by the fire like he'd done this every day of his life. "Caleb," Jacob said carefully. "A word." Outside on the porch, snow already stacking on the rail, Jacob kept his voice low. "You know those men are going to come looking for wherever she went. I expect they will. You know nothing about her. Not her name, not what kind of trouble she's carrying. I know she's got a baby that was 2 hours from freezing and a boy who hasn't eaten since yesterday, by the look of him." Caleb looked back through the window at the fire, at the shapes moving in its light. "That's enough for tonight." Jacob studied him a long moment, then shook his head, more resigned than surprised. "You're going to get us both killed being decent. Wouldn't be the first time decent got a man in trouble." Inside, Clara had gotten Rose to stop shivering, the baby's breathing evening out against her shoulder. When Caleb came back in, she looked up at him with the wary steadiness of a woman who had learned not to trust kindness at face value. "I have to tell you something," she said. "If you let us stay, even one night, it isn't just gossip you'll be dealing with." "Eat first," Caleb said. "Talk after. You don't understand what you're inviting into your house." "Ma'am." Caleb set a plate of bread and beans in front of her, and for the first time that night something in his voice softened without meaning to. "Nobody's going out into that storm tonight. Not you, not your children. Whatever's chasing you can wait until morning to be explained. Eat." Eli, who had finally sat down 2 feet from the fire, watched this exchange with the flat suspicion of an 8-year-old who has learned the hard way that grown men who seem kind usually want something. Caleb caught the boy's eye and didn't try to smile at him or win him over. He just gave a short nod, the kind one man gives another, and went to check the door was barred. Later, once Clara had settled the children into the small back room, she came out to find Caleb still awake, sitting at the table cleaning the rifle he hadn't needed to fire. "You didn't have to give up your bed," she said. "Wasn't using it for anything but sleeping in." He didn't look up from the rifle. "Boy's got questions he's not asking yet. Give him time." "How did you know that?" "Same way I know most things about quiet people." Caleb finally met her eyes. "I used to be one." Clara sat across from him, pulling her borrowed quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight. I know it isn't a small thing, what you've done." "Wasn't much of a choice," Caleb said. "Man doesn't turn a baby back out into weather like that. Not much virtue in it." "Plenty of men would have," Clara said quietly, and there wasn't an answer to that Caleb felt like giving, so he didn't try. He simply nodded once, set the rifle aside, and banked the fire a second time before finally, reluctantly, going to find a blanket of his own by the hearth. It was the first thing Caleb did that night that made Eli decide, quietly and without telling anyone, that maybe this one might be different. The storm kept the world outside white and unreachable for 2 full days, and somewhere in that stretch of time, Caleb's silent house started making noise again. It started small. Eli's carved wooden horse, a gift from his father, had lost a leg somewhere on the trail, and the boy sat turning it over in his hands one evening like he could will it whole. Caleb, without a word, took it from him, sat down at the table with a knife and a scrap of pine, and worked until the toy stood square on 4 legs again. He handed it back without ceremony. "You fixed it," Eli said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Wasn't much broken." Eli held the horse a long time before he spoke again. "My pa used to fix things too." "Good habit for a man to have," Caleb said, and went back to his coffee, and didn't ask the question sitting behind the boy's eyes. Rose, for her part, decided within a day that Caleb's shoulder was an acceptable place to fall asleep, which Caleb had strong opinions about and no ability to prevent. Jacob caught him standing at the window one evening, rocking slightly, the baby limp and drooling against his collar, and Caleb glared at him hard enough that Jacob had the decency to wait until he was safely in the barn before he started laughing. "Man rocks a baby to sleep and thinks nobody saw," Jacob told the horses. 10 years I've known him. Never once seen him hum. At dinner that night, Eli asked Caleb outright whether he could cook. "Some," Caleb said, with more confidence than the question deserved. Jacob, passing behind Clara's chair, leaned down and murmured just loud enough, "If boiled beans count as cooking, he's a better cook than I am." Clara laughed before she could stop herself, a short surprised sound, and Eli grinned at his plate, and for a moment the cabin held something it hadn't held in a long while, the particular warmth of people who weren't strangers anymore, even if none of them would have said so out loud. That night, once the children were asleep, Clara sat with Caleb by the stove, both of them quiet the way 2 tired people are quiet when talk feels like too much effort and too little at the same time. "You lost someone," she said eventually. "Not a question." "Wife. Daughter." Caleb didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't push. "My husband," she said instead, "died 5 months ago. Everyone in Red Creek believes it was an accident." "I'm not sure I do." Caleb turned to look at her properly then, the firelight showing the exhaustion under her eyes, and something else underneath that, a kind of stubborn watchfulness that hadn't broken yet no matter how close it had come. "Tell me in the morning," he said. "When you've slept." She nodded, grateful for the reprieve, and neither of them noticed how long they sat there afterward without needing to speak at all. Later that same week, once the roads had cleared enough for short trips, Jacob took Eli out to the corral to teach him a little riding, mostly to give the boys something to do besides worrying. Eli, full of 8-year-old confidence, insisted he already knew how. "Your ma tell you that?" Jacob asked, boosting him up onto the gentlest mare on the place. "Nobody had to tell me. I just know things." 10 seconds later Eli was sitting in the dirt, indignant, brushing straw off his trousers. "You said this horse was easy." Caleb, leaning on the fence rail nearby, called over without much sympathy. "I said the horse was easy. Didn't say anything about the rider." Jacob, straight-faced, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "That's the first joke I've heard out of him in 10 years. Somebody ought to write the date down." Even Eli laughed at that, dirt and all, and climbed back up to try again. The storm broke on the third morning, and by noon a rider came up Caleb's road at an unhurried pace that somehow felt more threatening than a gallop would have. Silas Crow dismounted like a man who owned whatever ground he stood on. He was older than Caleb by a decade, dressed in a dark coat too clean for ranch country, his boots polished despite 3 days of mud and melt. He didn't bother removing his hat. "Hart," Silas said. "I believe you've got something of mine in your house." "Don't recall taking anything that belonged to you." Caleb stood on the porch, rifle within reach but not raised, which was its own kind of message. "The widow Whitmore. She owes a debt against her late husband's property, and she's run rather than settle it like a decent person would." Silas produced a folded paper from his coat, held it out like it settled the matter on its own. "Official record. Her husband borrowed against the land 8 months before he died. I've come to collect, one way or the other." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Caleb, rose on her hip, and her voice came out steadier than her hands looked. "Thomas paid that debt in full before he died. I was there." "Then you'll have no trouble showing me the receipt," Silas said, not looking at her. "I don't have to show you anything." Silas's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's an interesting position to take with the man who holds paper on your children's future, Mrs. Whitmore." He turned back to Caleb. "This isn't your fight, Hart. Send her back with me and keep your ranch out of it." "She stays," Caleb said. "You barely know this woman." "I know enough." Silas studied him a long moment, the way a man studies a horse he's deciding whether to buy or shoot. "Folks in Red Creek are already talking about the rancher who took in a widow nobody trusts. By the time I'm through, they'll wonder what exactly you're protecting her from telling." "Let them talk," Caleb said again, and this time there was iron under it. Silas mounted back up, unhurried as he'd arrived. "You've made a mistake today. I hope she's worth it." He rode off toward town without another word, and Caleb stood watching until the rider disappeared over the ridge. Behind him, Clara's voice had gone thin. "I never should have come here. This is my trouble, not yours. It stopped being only yours the minute you knocked on my door." Caleb turned to face her. "That paper he's waving, you're certain it's false?" "Thomas told me the week before he died that the debt was settled. He said it plainly. He wasn't a man who forgot things like that." She looked down at Rose, then back up, and something in her had hardened since the morning. "Something was wrong before he died, Mr. Hart. I've felt it for months and had nowhere safe enough to say it out loud." "Say it now," Caleb said. "You're safe enough here." By the end of the week, Red Creek had a new favorite subject, and none of the versions being passed around the general store bore much resemblance to the truth. Some said Clara Whitmore had run off owing half the town money. Others said she'd bewitched the rancher everyone thought was too hard-hearted for foolishness. A few, quieter and more careful with their words, wondered aloud whether Silas Crow's story added up as neatly as he wanted it to. But gossip rewards the loudest version, and Silas made sure his was loud. Eli came back from a trip to the store with Jacob one afternoon, silent and stiff-shouldered the whole ride home. At dinner he finally said it. 2 ladies at the counter were talking about Ma. They said she stole from Mr. Crow. Clara went pale. Caleb set his fork down. "People say things they don't know the truth of," Caleb told the boy. "Rumor isn't proof of anything except that folks like to talk. You understand the difference?" Eli nodded slowly, though his jaw stayed tight the rest of the meal. The pressure kept climbing. Jacob found the south pasture fence cut clean through 2 mornings later, no storm damage to explain it, just deliberate work with wire cutters. "Somebody's testing how far they can push before we notice," Jacob said, crouched by the severed wire, and Caleb didn't disagree. That night, once the children were down, Clara finally told Caleb what she'd been carrying since the day Thomas died. He came home strange, about a month before. Quiet in a way that wasn't like him. He kept saying he needed to protect us, that he'd found something that could hurt people if it got out. She twisted her hands in her lap. 3 days later he went out to check the north line and never came back. They found him at the bottom of a ravine. Everyone called it a fall. You don't believe that? Thomas rode that ravine trail 100 times. He knew every stone in it. Her voice cracked, just slightly, before she steadied it. I think he found something Silas Crow didn't want found. I think that's why Silas wants me gone, and why he needs everyone to believe I'm the dishonest one instead of him. Caleb sat with that a long moment, the fire popping low behind the grate. Then we stop guessing, he said. We find whatever your husband found. And if it gets you killed too? Then at least it'll have been for something. He meant it lighter than it landed, but neither of them laughed. Where would a man hide something he was afraid to lose? Clara thought about it, really thought, turning over every ordinary place in the Whitmore house where nothing had ever seemed hidden before. Slowly, an idea started forming behind her eyes. Something about the false bottom in Thomas's tool chest, a place she'd never once thought to look because grief had kept her from opening that chest at all. They rode out to the old Whitmore place the next clear morning, Jacob staying back with the children, Caleb keeping close beside Clara the whole way like he expected trouble to appear out of the tree line at any moment. The house sat empty and cold, everything exactly as Clara had left it the night she ran. She went straight for the tool chest in the back room, hands trembling as she lifted out the trays of nails and hinges Thomas had kept so carefully organized. Underneath, a thin board didn't sit quite flush. Caleb pried it up with his knife. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a ledger, a stack of letters, and a folded map marked with notations in careful handwriting. Clara opened the ledger first, and her breath caught. These are dates. Payments. This is the debt Silas claims I owe. Thomas paid it, right here, 6 months before he died. Receipt number, witness signature, all of it. Caleb was already working through the letters, his jaw setting harder with each one. He wasn't just protecting your family's name. Look here. He held one out. 3 other ranches, same pattern, a debt claim that appears out of nowhere, a document that looks legal, and a family too scared or too poor to fight it in court. Thomas was keeping track of every one. He was building a case, Clara said quietly. He knew Silas was doing this to other people too, and he was going to expose him. Which is exactly why somebody made sure he never got the chance. Caleb folded the letters back together, careful as if they might tear apart in his hands. This isn't a debt dispute anymore, Clara. It's fraud, against half the ranchers in this county, and it looks a good deal like your husband was killed to keep it quiet. The word landed heavy in the empty house. Clara sat down hard on the edge of the chest, one hand pressed flat against the ledger like she could hold Thomas's memory steady through it. If we bring this to the marshal, she said, Silas will know exactly where it came from. He already knows we've been out here. Caleb had crossed to the window without quite meaning to, scanning the tree line out of old habit. A man like Crow doesn't leave a debt claim standing on its own. He'll have watched this house since the night you left it. He was right to worry. Neither of them saw the rider half a mile off, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods, watching the Whitmore house through a spyglass before turning his horse back toward town at a hard gallop. By the time Caleb and Clara rode back to the ranch with the ledger wrapped safe inside Caleb's saddlebag, Silas Crow already knew exactly what they'd found, and exactly what he intended to do about it. The attack came 2 nights later, in the dead hours when even Caleb's careful habits had finally let him sleep. It was Jacob who woke first, roused by the smell before the sound, smoke, sharp and wrong, curling under the bunkhouse door. He was out into the yard in his boots and nothing else, shouting Caleb's name, and by the time Caleb reached the porch the barn was already glowing orange against the night sky, flames climbing fast through dry timber. "Get them out." Jacob was already running for the horses, panicked animals screaming inside the burning structure. Caleb didn't wait to ask who'd said it. He went straight for the house, Clara already awake and pulling Eli from his blankets, Rose crying against her shoulder. "Out the back, now," Caleb said, and didn't have to say it twice. Eli froze at the door, twisting back toward Caleb. "You're not coming. Right behind you. Go." Caleb pushed the boy gently but firmly through the door, and the moment the family was clear he turned back toward the barn, where Jacob was fighting to drag two terrified horses free of their stalls. Gunfire cracked from the tree line, 3 shots in quick succession, and Caleb understood then that the fire wasn't the whole plan. It was cover. He got the last horse loose just as a shape came at him out of the smoke, one of Silas's men, and behind him 2 more converging on the yard. Caleb fired once, dropped the nearest man's rifle from his hands with a shot that took him through the shoulder, then felt the answering bullet catch him high in the side, spinning him half around before he went down hard in the frozen mud. "Caleb!" Clara's voice cut through everything, raw and terrified, and she was running back toward him before Jacob could stop her, Rose thrust into Eli's arms behind her. "Get back," Caleb managed, one hand pressed hard against his side, but Clara was already kneeling beside him, and whatever fear had driven her across a frozen range with 2 children in tow had apparently burned itself out somewhere along the way, because there was nothing left in her now but a fierce, unshakable steadiness. "I am not leaving you in the mud," she said, and meant it in a way that settled something in him even through the pain. Jacob got the barn fire beaten back with buckets and sheer stubbornness before it could spread to the house, and the marshal's men, summoned by a boy from the next ranch over who'd seen the flames and ridden hard for town, arrived just as the last of Silas's men fled into the dark. Caleb was carried inside, bleeding but breathing, and Clara didn't leave his side once, her hand wrapped around his the whole time the doctor worked, steady even when her voice wasn't. Caleb spent 2 days in a fever that came and went like weather, and Clara barely left the chair beside his bed the whole time, Rose asleep in a basket at her feet, Eli standing guard at the window with a determination well beyond his years. While Caleb healed, Clara went to work. She rode into Red Creek herself, the ledger and Thomas's letters wrapped safe in a satchel, and asked to see Marshal Samuel Reed directly. The marshal had heard Silas's version of events for months and had, until then, seen no strong reason to doubt it. Clara laid the documents on his desk and let the evidence speak instead of pleading her own case. Samuel read slowly, methodically, the way a careful lawman reads anything that might matter. "This receipt is dated and witnessed," he said eventually. "If it's genuine, Crow's claim against your property was false from the start." "It's genuine," Clara said. "And it isn't only my property. Read the letters. There are at least 3 other families he's done this to." Samuel read those too, and his expression, already grave, went grimmer still. "Your husband was building a case against him." "I believe that's why my husband is dead," Clara said, steady even now. The marshal sat back, turning the pieces over. "I'll need to speak with the other families named here. Quietly, before Crow knows we're asking." He looked up at her. "You understand what you're accusing a man like Silas Crow of?" "I understand exactly what he's already done to try and stop me from saying it." Clara held his gaze without flinching. "He burned a man's barn and shot him in his own yard to keep this ledger buried. I'd say the accusation fits." Word of the marshal's quiet inquiries reached Silas faster than either of them expected. Silas had eyes in more places than the town square, including, it would turn out, inside the marshal's own office. By the time Clara rode back to Caleb's ranch, Silas already understood that his scheme was unraveling, and a cornered man with that much to lose rarely chooses to go quietly. "Caleb," propped up in bed and stubbornly recovering faster than the doctor advised, listened to all of it with his jaw tight. "He's not going to let this end in a courtroom," Caleb said. "No," Clara agreed. "I don't expect he is." Silas Crow came back one final time, 4 days later, with more men than he'd ever ridden with before and nothing left to lose. Caleb met him in the yard, still moving carefully from his wound, rifle steady in his hands despite it. Clara stood on the porch behind him, the ledger held against her chest instead of hidden this time. "You could have taken the money and let this go," Silas called out. "Instead you've made yourself an enemy of every powerful man in this county who'd rather this story stayed buried." "Funny thing about the truth," Caleb said. "It doesn't much care who finds it inconvenient. You'd burn down everything you've built for a widow you've known a month. She's not the only thing I'm protecting." Caleb didn't look away from him. "They're my family now. All 3 of them." Silas's mouth twisted, and he gave a short signal to the men beside him. What happened next moved fast, shouting, horses wheeling, a shot fired wide that sent Jacob diving for cover with Eli already pulling Rose's basket behind the water trough exactly the way Caleb had taught him to during a quiet afternoon that suddenly mattered more than either of them had known. Caleb and Silas came together hard, the fight ugly and short, Caleb's wound screaming with every blow but his grip never loosening. Behind them, Clara didn't wait to be rescued. She strode forward, ledger raised, and shouted loud enough for every man in that yard to hear. "Marshal Samuel Reed has already spoken to 3 families this man has done this to. The paper he's been waving is a forgery, and everyone in this territory is about to know it." That was the moment the marshal's riders came up the road at a gallop, having ridden through the night once word reached him that Silas was making a final move. What followed happened fast. Silas's men, already outnumbered and increasingly unwilling to hang for a scheme that wasn't theirs to begin with, dropped their weapons one by one. Silas himself made one last desperate lunge for the satchel in Clara's hands, and it was Jacob, of all people, who put him flat on his back in the snow with a single well-placed punch he'd apparently been saving for exactly this occasion. "10 years I've wanted to do that to somebody," Jacob said, shaking out his knuckles, and even in the chaos of the moment, Eli laughed. Caleb went down to one knee as the adrenaline finally left him, the wound in his side making itself known all at once. Clara was beside him in an instant, hands framing his face, terror plain in her eyes. "Are the children safe?" he asked her, before anything else. "Yes. Yes, they're safe." Caleb closed his eyes, and whatever relief moved through him had nothing to do with the ranch still standing or his own life spared. Clara understood, in that moment, exactly how far past sheltering strangers this had become for him, and exactly how far past being sheltered it had become for her too. Silas Crow stood trial in Red Creek 3 weeks later, and the ledger, the letters, and the testimony of 3 other ranching families ended whatever reputation his money had bought him. He was sentenced to the territorial prison, and the families he'd cheated began, slowly, the work of rebuilding what he'd taken. Caleb healed slower than he liked to admit, and Clara stayed through every day of it, first out of necessity and then, plainly, because neither of them wanted to imagine the alternative. "You could have sent us back to town once the trial ended," Clara said one evening, the 2 of them on the porch while Eli taught Rose to clap her hands by the fire inside. "I keep waiting for you to tell me it's time." "Been waiting for the right moment to tell you something else instead," Caleb said. He turned to face her fully, something unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there the night she first knocked on his door. "This house has been quiet a long time, Clara. I told myself I liked it that way. Truth is, I only ever stopped noticing how empty it was because I made myself stop noticing." He took a breath. "I don't want it quiet again. I want you and the children here. Not as folks I took in out of a storm. As my family." Clara's eyes filled, though she was smiling through it. "I think I started loving you somewhere around the second night, when you fixed Eli's toy horse and pretended it didn't mean anything to you." "Meant plenty," Caleb admitted. "Didn't know how to say so yet. Say it now. I love you, he said simply. Stay. Yes, Clara said, and there was nothing hesitant left in her voice at all. Yes, we'll stay. Jacob, watching from the barn doorway, looked deeply satisfied with himself, as though he'd seen this coming since the third night of the storm. He muttered to the nearest horse, about time. I was starting to think I'd have to say something myself. They married that spring in a small ceremony behind the house, under the same cottonwood tree where Caleb had once buried the family he thought he'd never replace. Not because Clara and the children replaced anyone, but because that same ground had room, it turned out, for new life to grow alongside the old grief instead of it. Eli stood beside Caleb the whole ceremony, proud in a way that made his mother's eyes go bright. Rose slept through the entire thing in Clara's arms, exactly as she'd slept through so many dangerous nights before this safer one. Months later, the ranch that had once felt like the loneliest place in the territory rang with the ordinary noise of a full house, Eli's boots on the porch steps, Rose's laughter carrying from the kitchen, Jacob's dry commentary on all of it from whatever chair he'd claimed as his own. Caleb had added 2 rooms onto the house that summer, more space than 4 people strictly needed, and when Clara asked him why, he just shrugged like it was obvious. Never know how full a house is meant to get, he said, until you stop being afraid to fill it. The man who once believed his ranch was safer standing empty had learned, in the end, that the safest thing he ever did was open his door to people who needed him, and the bravest thing was letting them stay. Somewhere behind that lesson sat another one, quieter but just as true. That a piece of paper claiming to be official proof of a debt is still just paper, and the families who question it, who keep their own records and ask their own questions instead of accepting a stranger's word, are the families who protect what's theirs. Thomas Whitmore died trying to prove that. His widow and children lived to finish what he started. And every evening after, when the work was done and the lamps were lit, Caleb Hart opened that same front door one more time. Not because anyone outside needed shelter from the cold, but because the people he loved most in the world were already home, waiting for him, on the other side of it.